2012 was a great year for anime. This year marked the beginning of instant classics like Kuriko's Basketball, an anime about handsome basketball boys playing basketball, Psycho Pass, an excellent series that explores a society built around utilitarianism and the dark, chaotic future in which the government reads your mind, and of course, the Everest of peak anime culture, High School DxD. But for all the good that came from that year, and all the series that continued their syndication, there was one series that would rise above the rest, take the crown, and name itself the undisputed king of anime streaming sites around the world. And that show, ladies and gentlemen, was Sword Art Online.
Don't lose your way, your mind, we have to be.
Now, as I move forward in this video, I want to make it clear that while I won't be explicitly covering spoilers for SAO, I will be discussing plot points within the series and sharing clips from the anime to provide background and context for my main points going forward. If you're sensitive to spoilers and haven't seen SAO, I recommend you watch the series before continuing here. That being said, let's begin. The premise of Sword Art Online is simple. We follow our main protagonist Kirito as he travels from one virtual MMORPG to another, those being Sword Art Online, Alfheim,
actually it's pronounced Alfheim,
Gun Gale, and Underworld, all of which introduce various villains that seek to do harm to the outside world or to characters that Kirito has relationships with via their meddling inside their chosen game. In the first world Kirito explores, this takes the form of Akihiko Kayaba, Sword Art Online's development director and game master, who decides on manufacturing the unique circumstance of trapping players inside this virtual world with no way to log out. The players of this game can free themselves, but to do so would mean clearing every level of the game without dying, basically forcing every player into an any percent permadeath nuzlocke on steroids for motivations that remain cryptic and intentionally unclear. From here we follow Kirito at different points in time, jumping from event to event in his new life that helps illustrate truly how bleak and dire their situation truly is. Upon the realization that death is in fact permanent and that despite abilities, magic, and healing systems, humans in this world are still fragile, and that at any point the thin veil of safety you construct for yourself can be lifted to reveal the unflinching truth that this world doesn't care about you and that the odds are stacked against you. To this end, Kirito attempts to isolate himself from his pain by withdrawing from people and avoiding unnecessary relationships to the point of living alone, traveling alone, and fighting his way across Aincrad alone. Interestingly, despite Kirito's descent into solitude, we see that the world around him continues to evolve and that much like the real world, people take up different jobs and methods of coping to see themselves through to the end. Some never leave the warmth of the starting town, while others act as support for warriors on the battlefield, crafting items, running shops, and attempting to recreate the comforts of life back home, while inversely, there exists a group that seeks to finish the game using teamwork and strategy to finally free themselves of the purgatory they find themselves in. Part of the strength of this original arc is its dichotomy between people and the exploration of those very aspects that makes us human. Grief, hope, despair, rage, and even love work their way into various plot points and motivations that the surviving characters use to move forward and grow in relation to one another. Asuna, Kirito's eventual partner, provides emotional and moral strength to Kirito while being a true badass in her own right, never running from her moral obligation to those she protects, and proves to Kirito that finishing the game is more than just an act of survival. She proves that life, in all its beauty and splendor, can happen here too. For me, these moments of character growth for Kirito and Asuna are what cemented this series in my mind as the true crowning jewel of the 2012 summer anime season. And despite other heavy hitters during that year, the emotional weight this narrative carried and the stylish way it presented its climactic boss encounters spoke to me in a way that few shows could. Now, for all the praise I heaped on this series just now, you're probably asking yourself if you and I had watched and experienced the same show. And you're not wrong for thinking that. In fact, I sometimes ask myself the same thing too when I consider the show in its entirety, because when viewing the first season in a vacuum, I always find something to love. Outside of that, however, is when things change. I'd be remiss to ignore the infamy that SAO carries with itself today. And if I'm honest with you, my own love for the series began to wane early into the Alfheim arc when certain writing decisions began to make it clear that the show I thought so highly of may not have been anything more than the atypical shonen harem power fantasy, which, don't get me wrong, has its time and place, but for the maturity I thought the show was going for, I couldn't help but find myself disappointed with each new passing season, until I eventually dropped the series altogether 3 episodes into the Underworld arc. Now, do I love SAO? I do. Did I become frustrated with the series and perhaps drop it prematurely? Yeah, I think that would be accurate. From what I've heard, the newest arc approaches the same heights as the first arc of the series and quickly became a well-liked and generally praised adaptation of the light novel material. And I love that. I want to like this show, and is part of the reason why I stuck around as long as I did. So now that the current arc is concluded and I've written a whole SAO script without watching it, I may go back and reevaluate my feelings on this series as a whole, and when that time comes, I hope to share it with all of you. But this video isn't meant to be a summary of the series, and if you're still watching at this point, then first of all, thank you, and secondly, would like to, if you will, take you back almost 17 years to the year 2004. For those of you that remember this, you'll recognize it as the Saturday Video Entertainment System. This was a 7-hour block of action animation that functioned as the successor to Toonami's then defunct afternoon block. This lineup of shows ran from about 7 p.m. to 2 a.m. and at the time catered to an audience different from Cartoon Network's afternoon and Adult Swim audiences. Being 10 years old at the time, I didn't even know that the shows I wanted so badly to watch were from Japan or what anime as a concept even was. But these shows did feel undeniably different from the cartoons I watched during the day. As the evenings wore on, the programming became decidedly more adult to match the darkness of the world outside my door. My parents would turn out the lights as they prepared for bed until eventually the world fell silent and gray with just the TV light to keep the living room lit. There was a mystery to these shows, something enigmatic that I just couldn't place. The environments and neon landscapes of the 80s and early 90s anime that flickered across the screen had a tinge of danger to them, and explored themes of violence, loneliness, and maturity that I had yet to develop my own understanding of. Hiding underneath the excitement of seeing fight scenes animated in flashy detail and the dopamine-fueled rush that filled my overly excited mind, there was something under the surface that hinted at a world separate and unmistakably different from my own. I'm sure those of you who grew up during the Toonami era are familiar with this feeling. In an age when the internet was still just becoming something that families were welcoming into their home, these shows captured my imagination in such a way that made it hard to resist their temptation and offered little in the way of explanation as to what they were or what made them so markedly unique. Aside from being a prelude into how I grew interested in anime, I bring this up because at or around the same time, I began to develop an interest in a show called hacksign, which began airing during the 12 a.m. slot of the SVES Saturday night run that served as my main motivation to stay awake and encouraged me to sit through the rest of the anime that was then airing at the time. While I never watched the series in its completion, to many people, this along with Inuyasha were the first examples of what is now considered part of the anime subgenre of isekai. To those unfamiliar with this term, isekai's literal translation to English is different world or otherworld and describes a manga, light novel, or anime series in which a character from our own world is transported to an alternate world or time. Think Alice in Wonderland in the West, but for our intents and purposes, in the case of Inuyasha, this would describe the protagonist Kagome and her transportation to feudal Japan, or in the case of hacksign Tsukasa's unique circumstance of being trapped in a virtual world with no way out. Now, if this sounds familiar, it's because it is. hacksign was the show that connected the genre of isekai fiction to the modern-day MMORPG, introducing many of the conventions we would come to see today in shows like No Game No Life, Konosuba, Shield Hero, That Time I Was Reincarnated as a Slime, and ReZero, to name a few. And I mean only a few. These anime stand out as prime examples of series that share the same premise and borrow many of the themes introduced in hacksign, namely themes of escapism, anxiety, loneliness, self-identity, and mix this with MMORPG elements like dungeon crawling, leveling systems, magic systems to create something that was, at the time, totally unique from what was being produced alongside it. Critics praised the series for its attempt at exploring real depth and giving serious attention to Tsukasa's situation. Like Kirito, Tsukasa is unable to log out from the game he finds himself in and may face real-life danger should his HP drop below 0. Similar premises for sure, but the difference, however, is in the details. Whereas Kirito can draw on his past experiences playing SAO and other games from similar genres, Tsukasa cannot, for you see, Tsukasa wakes up in The World, the name of the MMORPG in the .hack universe, completely devoid of memory, unable to recall who he is or how he got here. Interestingly as well is that, again, unlike Kirito and the other players in the world, Tsukasa is the only one who's unable to log out, and the only one to feel pain when damaged. The uniqueness of Tsukasa's situation is then what bonds other characters to him, and like the audience, results in characters as interested in Tsukasa's memory and origin as we at home are, slowly using the settings and dystopian landscapes of the world to draw us in before peeling back the layers of Tsukasa's character as he slowly regains his memories, however shocking and horrifying they may be. It's revealed later in the series that Tsukasa had been playing in the world long before he had become trapped inside. The world became a place to escape to as the real world around him slowly collapsed, first with the death of his mother, and later by the mental and physical abuse of an overworked and alcoholic father, the pain of which continued to ostracize Tsukasa at school and exacerbated a growing desire to leave her own identity behind for that of a male avatar in the game. What's so amazing about this reveal later in the series is how it comes to define Tsukasa's relationship with herself. Anne, Tsukasa's true name, in many ways chooses to reaffirm an identity in-game that substitutes her identity in the real world, choosing to make the world of hacksign a substitute of the world outside the game that's grown so cold since her mother's passing. This in turn is ultimately what made her a target in-game for what is later explained to be a plot to repress what was the creation of the ultimate in-game AI, Aura. The idea being that using Tsukasa's negative disposition and desire to sever ties with the real world would stunt the growth of Aura, whose fate in turn had been tied to Tsukasa, resulting in Tsukasa's memory loss and the events that predated the show. As I'm sure most of us who have played games or marathoned an anime can attest to, the act of escapism in media can be a powerful mechanism of coping with various anxieties and problems we face in our day-to-day life. I myself have been guilty of such, and while my own insecurities will likely never live up to the same degree of severity that Anne of hacksign experienced, as we only touched on a few of the predicaments she finds herself in, at a fundamental level, the feelings that Anne goes through are those that are deeply relatable and uniquely human. Interestingly, the creators and writers behind the .hack franchise were not originally manga artists or individuals with experience making anime. They were instead a team assembled by gaming studios Bandai and CyberConnect 2 to make a series of games that, in their words, would challenge the very concept of what a traditional RPG was. In a 2003 interview with Hiroshi Matsuyama, the then president of CyberConnect 2, and Daisuke Uchiyama, a leader of Bandai's gaming department, described the concept behind their fledgling game project, .hack, to be an offline RPG set in a simulated MMORPG. This would be done to create the illusion of playing something akin to popular MMOs at the time, while providing a tighter storyline like that of a traditional RPG. Their goal was to create, as cliche now as it sounds, a game within a game. Something that would leave a mark on gamers of the early 2000s and allow it to stand out from an ever-growing crowd of titles at home and abroad in the West. To accomplish this, the team behind the game decided to produce an anime series, hacksign, to help market and bolster sales of the game with the hopes of creating something equally as fascinating for non-gamers. To this end, they hired director Kazunori Ito of Ghost in the Shell fame to develop the screenplay, and the composer behind Madoka Magica and our poster boy SAO Yuki Kajira to lend her musical talents and expertise. Now, the big question is, with all the resources and talented directors, writers, producers, and composers working across both the anime, game, and OVA releases of the series, was the initial run of .hack a success? In the end, the series was fairly divisive. As a game, the plotline and novelty of playing an offline, online MMORPG was enough to keep fans engaged, but the game found itself mired in criticism for lacking a sense of real difficulty and having awkward, stiff motion controls. The anime was likewise divisive, drawing criticism for lack of action seen on screen, instead focusing more on the melodrama of who the players are, and in particular the mysteries surrounding Tsukasa. Ultimately, however, .hack came and went, and though still maintaining a cult following of sorts, it never really cemented itself in the collective consciousness of the larger anime community, like Inuyasha and the original release of Fullmetal Alchemist, despite being from the same time period. For the next 8 years, until the emergence of SAO, with few exceptions like Digimon, the landscape of isekai and anime in general were dominated by the martial arts-inspired shonen battle series of the late 90s and the revival of post-Evangelion-style giant mecha shows and the magical girl anime and kids-oriented series like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon dominating the market with nary a hint of isekai as we know it today. So why spend all this time setting up .hack and giving all this background information on a series and a time period from the world of yesterday? Well, partly because I'm genuinely interested in this and enjoy talking about it, and partly to give context and perhaps some clarity on what came before and after the boom of isekai inspired by the success of SAO. You see, isekai can be broadly broken down into two schools of thought: those series that are set primarily in a traditional fantasy world, and those that are set in a world reflective of a JRPG. .hack may very well have been the progenitor of this latter style, breaking away from a more traditional fantasy trope that we saw in the time prior to SAO, before having the industry as a whole and the meaning of isekai in a cultural sense go on to be defined by a series set in a traditional JRPG setting. Isekai, as it's known in 2020, is nearly synonymous with this definition of the word. If we just take SAO in a vacuum and look at some of its milestones, we see the incredible success it's achieved. Global sales of its light novel run alone have reached 26 million as of 2020, making it the second best-selling light novel series of all time, putting it above the likes of Haruhi Suzumiya, Index, and Slime, all respectable series in their own right. As a multimedia franchise, the series has 8 games under its belt, totaling over 5.6 million units sold worldwide. A film, the spin-off series SAO Alternative Gun Gale Online, various manga spin-offs including a retelling of the light novel, a soft reboot of the original arc called SAO Progressive, and the anime itself, which just completed its 3rd season at the time of this video, with plans of animating the aforementioned SAO Progressive. And this is all intentional. Back in 2017, in an interview with Wataru Nakasuji, Sword Art Online Memory Defrag's promotional manager for US and Europe, on how they plan to push the SAO IP in the West, he's quoted as saying, "Our strategy is to sell Sword Art Online. All companies that are working under SAO are helping each other. So we're doing the promotion for the movies, and they, Aniplex, are doing promotion for the games. We're cross-promoting with each other to maximize SAO's IP value." The entire SAO community is tied together in the media mix. The figurines, the comics, novels, and anime are all intertwined so that they are doing the marketing together, added Nakasuji. That's the strength of SAO, as compared to other IPs, because they're all doing it as one big push. With a coordinated assault on all levels from the SAO team, with the intention of making this multimedia juggernaut as profitable as possible, we can see that they, just like the team behind .hack, plan to leave a permanent mark on the anime community. In theory, what was working for SAO should have worked for .hack. After all, their strategy and creative direction is eerily similar, though hindsight shows us that this is not so. In the end, the reason for SAO's success can be attributed to a multitude of factors that lent themselves to create an anime empire that continues to dominate the charts season after season, opening the door for similar light novel series to get their own anime adaptation, and created a market so saturated in RPG-based isekai that Kadokawa, a preeminent publisher in the light novel and manga industry, banned isekai stories from appearing in their manga contests of 2016. The future and staying power of this current wave of isekai is anyone's guess, but it would be undeniable, despite all the criticism and finger-waving from critics, to see SAO as anything other than the series that changed the world. Now guys, if you stuck around all the way to the end of this video and watched the whole thing in its entirety, then I want to say thank you. This is my first attempt at making a video like this, and speaking off the cuff now instead of reading the script that I wrote, I can't help but say that this was quite the experience. I've never written a script like this before or tried to put anything together for YouTube quite like this. And it was honestly quite fun. I'm looking forward to doing more of it and getting to know those of you that stick around and watch and leave comments. As someone who's been a passive viewer of the community for a long time in terms of anime and watching some of the giants out there that like to review and talk about this stuff, I feel honored to be a part of that community and trying to lend my own voice to shows and topics that I like. So if you like the material, guys, please remember liking the video or subscribing only helps me out, helps get the word out that I'm out making videos, and I'll do my best to continue to produce content that not only you like, but content that I enjoy, and hopefully brings you guys some sort of joy or I don't know, just something that you guys can enjoy. But that'll be it for today, guys. Thanks again. I'll see you in the next video. Peace, be safe, and good night or good morning or something. Okay, bye.